China doll. That's what they'd been calling her for 3 years. Not her name. Not Major. Just a 2-word dismissal delivered through overhead speakers so the entire floor could hear the laughter that followed. But Sarah Chen moved through the overnight halls of Seattle General in Philadelphia at 2:27 a.m. with the near-invisible efficiency of someone who'd learned long ago that being overlooked was far safer than being seen. They didn't know what her hands had held. They didn't know what her scars could tell. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining, tucked in her locker on the 3rd floor, had belonged to something larger than a hospital. Something that didn't exist on paper anymore. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm in room for 12 as Sarah adjusted the flow rate with the precision of someone who'd done this 10,000 times. The patient inside, a 67-year-old construction worker with COPD, slept while his oxygen saturation climbed from 84 to 91%. She'd been here for 7 hours. Still had 1 hour left before the day's shift arrived and the hospital remembered she existed, only to forget her again by lunch. The fluorescent lights hummed their permanent fluorescent hum, casting everything in that flat, institutional glow that made 2 a.m. look identical to 2 p.m. Sarah's scrubs were navy blue, unremarkable, the same color worn by 300 other nurses in this building. Her name badge was turned inward. The burn patient in 418 needed his dressing changed. Sarah moved with fluid efficiency, her movements surgical precise as she peeled away the old gauze, revealing the angry red skin beneath. The smell hit her, a complex chemical signature of antiseptic and healing tissue and something else, something that triggered a memory she'd buried 3 years ago. Kandahar. A medical tent. Hands that weren't hers working on a soldier who wouldn't stop screaming. She paused for exactly 1 breath, then continued. Her fingers never trembled. They never did. Pain was information. Fear was data. Both could be processed and filed away for later, when she was alone at 3 a.m. staring at the dying succulent on the break room windowsill, wondering if anything could be brought back from the edge of extinction or if some things were just meant to fade quietly. The charge nurse, Chen, found her restocking the supply cart at 3:14 a.m. His face carried the look of someone bearing news he didn't want to deliver. New guy starts at 6, Chen said. Chief of Emergency Medicine. From Johns Hopkins. Word is he doesn't tolerate inefficiency. Sarah's fingers paused on the roll of 2-inch tape. Chen was waiting for a response. He always waited for her responses, even though she rarely gave him more than 2 words. That was part of the contract she'd made with invisibility. You didn't demand much, and you weren't expected to give much back. Just competence. Just presence. Just enough to keep people alive until someone who mattered could take over. Acknowledged, she said. His name is Dr. Marcus Ashford. He wants to meet all department heads at 6. Wanted me to make sure the night shift is prepped for handoff at 7. Chen lowered his voice. People say he came here to make changes. Shake things up. You good with that? Sarah continued stocking the cart. Gauze pads. Suture kits. Sterile saline. Everything in its place. Everything ordered. Everything controlled. Night shift doesn't change, she said. Chen nodded like he understood, but he didn't. Nobody understood. They saw a mousy night nurse with a slight limp, someone who'd been passed over for charge nurse 3 times, who never advocated for herself, never complained about the impossible schedules, never pushed back. They saw someone diminished. Someone manageable. What they didn't see was the faded 75th Ranger Regiment patch sewn inside the jacket lining hanging in locker 247. What they didn't see was the way her left leg favored itself because a bullet had passed through her thigh in 2019 and she'd never reported it, never filed a Purple Heart claim, never used the incident as leverage for anything. What they didn't see were the scars that traced from her collarbone down into her scrub collar, thin white lines that caught the light when she bent over a patient, scars that told stories involving classified extractions and names that couldn't be spoken aloud, and 12 hostages who were supposed to be dead but weren't, because Operation Sandcastle had succeeded even though it officially never happened. The night shift continued its rhythm. A patient with pneumonia needed elevated O2 saturation. A teenager with a fractured wrist needed pain management. An elderly woman with congestive heart failure needed comfort. Sarah moved between rooms like water, finding its level, finding the crack where she fit, never pushing, never demanding, just being present exactly where she was needed. Her voice was a low murmur that calmed agitated patients. Her hands were steady. Her mind was compartmentalized in the way that only people who'd learned to separate survival from emotion could achieve. By 5:51 a.m., the overnight shift was winding down. Sarah completed her charting on the computer terminal, every vital sign recorded, every medication documented, every patient status updated for the day shift. The hospital was beginning to wake up. Maintenance staff pushed cleaning carts down the hallways. The coffee machine in the physician's lounge gurgled its morning ritual. The smell of antiseptic was replaced by the smell of breakfast from the cafeteria, eggs and toast and that particular institutional grease that existed nowhere else in the world. The doors to the emergency department opened at exactly 5:58 a.m. Dr. Marcus Ashford entered like he was taking command of a military installation. His white coat was pristine, not a wrinkle, not a spot, the kind of coat that suggested he'd never actually worked a full shift in it. He was tall, somewhere around 6 feet 2 inches, with the kind of jaw that could cut glass and the kind of posture that suggested a lifetime of expecting deference. His eyes were pale blue and surveyed the department with the cool assessment of someone marking territory, noting what could be improved, what could be discarded, what could be molded into something more aligned with his vision of perfection. He was maybe 45, old enough to have authority, young enough to believe his authority was absolute and permanent. Dishon stood to greet him. "Dr. Ashford. Welcome to Seattle General's Emergency Department. I'm Dishon Martinez, night shift charge nurse. We've got a brief handoff, we've had a quiet night, 3 admissions, 2 discharges, 1 stable ICU transfer. The day team is ready for the transition at 6:30. Dr. Ashford's expression didn't change. He was looking past Dishon, scanning the department, his gaze sweeping across the nursing station and the supply areas and the waiting room where the early morning patients were already beginning to settle in with their own minor crises and desperate hopes. "What's the median response time for critical stabilization in your department?" he asked. "Varies by case, but we aim for." "I didn't ask what you aim for. I asked for median response time." "Specific number." Dishon hesitated. "For minutes, 30 seconds. Approximately." "Approximately," Dr. Ashford repeated, the word tasting like failure in his mouth. "Not good enough. This department will achieve 3 minutes, 15 seconds within the next quarter. That's non-negotiable." He turned slowly, allowing his gaze to settle on the nurses working the floor. His eyes moved across 3 staff members, the day shift resident starting early, a respiratory therapist checking ventilator settings, and then stopped on Sarah, who was entering patient data without looking up. Dr. Ashford's expression shifted. Not into kindness. Into something sharper. Recognition of a threat, though he wouldn't have framed it that way. He saw a nurse in her late 30s, hair pulled back tight, movements economical and precise, someone who was clearly competent but had chosen not to advance, not to compete, not to be visible. This was the type of nurse that good administrative structures didn't require, the ones who simply worked, who didn't demand recognition, who could be depended upon to show up and do the job without ego. And Dr. Ashford did not trust people without ego. Ego was how you proved you deserved power. Ego was how you moved upward. Ego was how you made sure everyone knew exactly what you'd accomplished and why you deserved to be feared. He walked toward the nursing station. "What's your name?" he asked Sarah. She looked up. Her eyes were dark brown, neutral, unremarkable. She didn't smile. She didn't attempt the kind of ingratiating warmth that people usually deployed toward authority. "Sarah," she said. "Sarah what?" "Chen." "And what is your position here, Sarah Chen?" "Night shift nurse." Dr. Ashford's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. One-word answers. Minimal information. No elaboration. No enthusiasm. No performance. It was as if she was deliberately withholding engagement, deliberately staying small, deliberately refusing to participate in the normal human theater of professional interaction where you expanded your presence to match the presence of authority, where you demonstrated your worth through words and displays of deference. "How long have you worked in emergency medicine?" he asked. Sarah didn't hesitate. 13 years. He waited for her to continue, to volunteer information, to perform the social work of establishing credibility. But Sarah simply returned to her charting, her fingers moving across the keyboard with deliberate focus, her attention returning to the patient data in front of her as if the conversation had already concluded. To her, it had. She'd answered his questions. She'd provided the requested information. The interaction was complete. Dr. Ashford's hands tightened at his sides. His presence made the air pressure change, that particular shift that happens when someone accustomed to commanding attention encounters someone entirely indifferent to their authority. He stood there for exactly 4 seconds, long enough for anyone watching to recognize the moment as a confrontation, short enough that he could frame his departure as a choice rather than a dismissal. "We'll discuss expectations in the department meeting," he said to no one in particular. "Everyone. All shifts. Conference room. 1 week. Mandatory attendance." He turned and walked toward the physician's lounge, his white coat moving like a sail, and Sarah returned her full attention to the chart in front of her, her hands steady as surgical instruments, her face revealing nothing of what was happening beneath the surface. But inside, in the part of her that had learned to compartmentalize survival, she was already running calculations. A new administrator meant new rules. New rules meant someone was going to push her, test her, eventually discover that invisibility was only a choice that could be overridden by someone with enough institutional power to demand visibility. She had 3 years left. If she could survive 3 more years without anyone discovering what the faded patch in her locker represented, she could transfer to Walter Reed as a civilian contractor. Clean break. New identity. A place where people didn't ask questions and the work was only about the work. 3 years was manageable. People like Dr. Ashford cycled through institutions all the time. New chief of emergency medicine, big plans, burn out within 18 months, transfer to somewhere else that would tolerate his need for control. She'd seen it before. She would not see it this time. But 3 years from now, standing in the rain at a bus stop with a cardboard box containing everything that mattered to her, a cracked mug, a dying plant, a photo from Kandahar with half the faces already crossed out by time and enemy fire, Sarah would understand that the moment Dr. Ashford walked into this department was the moment everything began to change, the moment her invisibility started to crack, the moment the entire architecture of her carefully constructed small life shifted on its foundations and would never settle back into the same shape again. The day shift arrived at 6:22 a.m. The sun rose over Philadelphia. Sarah handed off her patients to nurses who would carry them through the daylight hours, and she walked out into the parking lot where her car was waiting, her scrub still damp with the particular humidity that emergency medicine creates, her hand still steady, her composure still intact. Behind her, Seattle General continued its work. And inside the physician's lounge, Dr. Marcus Ashford was already making notes about departmental inefficiencies, already planning his restructuring, already deciding which people would need to be bent toward his vision of proper hierarchy and unquestioned authority, already marking Sarah Chen as someone who would require special attention. The morning rounds moved with the precision of a military formation, though none of the residents knew it yet. Dr. Marcus Ashford commanded the ICU like a general surveying conquered territory, his white coat starched so crisp it could cut glass, his voice modulated to a frequency that made subordinates straighten their spines. Sarah moved 2 steps behind him with the iPad displaying vitals, her scrubs tucked in at the waist, her badge clipped exactly level with her collarbone. She was the kind of invisible that came from years of practice, present but unremarkable, competent but deferential, the way she'd learned to move through hostile spaces where being noticed meant being targeted. Bed 7 held Marcus Din, 64, sepsis from a perforated bowel, 3 days post-op and still fighting. His fever had spiked to 103.7 at shift change. Sarah had been watching his lactate levels climb with the slow creep of catastrophe. The cultures weren't back yet, but the pattern was there if you knew how to read the signs, the kind of pattern Sarah had learned to read in field hospitals where antibiotics were scarce and decisions had to be made with incomplete information and absolute certainty. Ashford stopped at the bedside, glanced at the medication list on the screen, and turned to the surgical resident. Increase the epinephrine infusion. We need more catecholamine support. 2 milligrams per kilogram, for push. He said it the way men who'd never been questioned deliver certainty. The residents nodded, already reaching for the medication cabinet. Sarah's eyes moved across the numbers on the screen. 2 milligrams per kilogram. For a 70-kilogram man, that was 140 milligrams. She looked at the chart. He'd written 2 milligrams. 2. Not 140. A decimal point placed where it shouldn't be, a zero missing like a missing tooth in a smile that would kill the patient in under 40 seconds. The residents were moving. Someone was opening the foreport. Sarah took one breath, just one, measured and clean, and spoke in the voice she'd perfected over a decade of navigating systems that weren't built to listen to her. Doctor, the decimal. Not a question. Not a request for permission to speak. Just information, the way you'd say the fire alarm had been triggered. The medication tray froze mid-motion. Every resident's eyes snapped toward her like compass needles finding magnetic north. Dr. Ashford turned with the kind of slowness that suggested his neck was attached to a rotating mechanism, and the smile that spread across his face was the smile of a man who'd just been given permission to demonstrate his authority. I'm sorry, he said, speaking to the residents but making sure his voice carried to Sarah. Did the nurse just question my order? Sarah kept her voice level. The decimal placement, doctor. That dose would induce cardiac arrest. She pointed to the screen without stepping forward, maintaining the distance that kept this professional instead of personal. Ashford's smile thinned. I'll take that under advisement. He turned back to the medication tray. Carry out the order as written. He paused, then glanced back at Sarah. You're dismissed from rounds, Nurse Chen. We'll continue without the editorial commentary. The dismissal hung in the air like cigarette smoke. Sarah nodded once and stepped back, moving toward the corridor with the same measured pace she'd maintained. She didn't see the surgical resident who'd frozen with the syringe, didn't see Ashford's jaw tighten when the resident glanced at the decimal point again and then back at him, didn't hear the quiet "Wait, sir," that came 3 seconds later when someone finally did the math. She was already gone, moving through the hallway with the kind of composure that felt like iron beneath her skin. The overhead page crackled at 1,400 hours. Sarah was at the medication dispensary checking inventory when her name came through the hospital-wide speaker system in a voice she didn't recognize but understood perfectly. Can our little China doll please report to the supply closet on 3? Dr. Ashford needs someone to reach the top shelf. The pause before the page ended felt deliberate. Strategic. The kind of pause that gave the entire floor time to process the name, the nickname, the humiliation delivered at broadcast volume. From the nurse's station, she heard laughter. Not unkind laughter, just the sound of people who understood the hierarchy that had been made visible, the reset button that had been pressed. Sarah set down the inventory tablet and walked toward the elevator. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was steady. The only thing that betrayed her was the slight pressure in her chest, the kind of pressure that came from knowing exactly what was waiting for her. The supply closet on the 3rd floor was narrow, lined with boxes of sterile gauze and 4 bags and the smell of antiseptic so strong it coated the back of her throat. Dr. Ashford was waiting inside with the door already closed behind him. His tie was still knotted perfectly. His hands were in his pockets. He looked like a man who'd already planned what he was going to say and had simply been waiting for the stage to be set. You embarrass me in front of my residents, he said, not angry but something colder than anger, disappointment in someone he'd already decided was beneath him. In front of my team. That's insubordination. That's practicing beyond your scope of practice. I could have your license suspended, you understand that? One phone call to the state board and you're finished. Everything you've built, gone. Sarah took one measured breath. Her right hand pressed against the stainless steel shelf beside her, and she felt the texture of cold metal grounding her, anchoring her. One tear escaped, just one, precise as a surgical incision, and she wiped it away without breaking eye contact. When she spoke, her voice had dropped an octave. It sounded like something emerging from beneath ice. "You're mistaking silence for weakness, Doctor." Ashford stepped closer. He was tall enough that she had to tilt her head back slightly, and his proximity was meant to be intimidating, meant to collapse her sense of space and safety. "Test me again and you'll learn the difference." He reached past her for a box of 4 bags on the shelf above her head, brushing her shoulder deliberately. The message was clear. "I own this space. I own you." Sarah didn't move. She let him reach, let him take what he'd come for, and when he turned to leave, she was still standing there with her hand on the cold shelf and her jaw clenched against words she wouldn't say, not yet, not until she knew the cost of speaking them. The parking lot confrontation came 3 days later, during shift change when the outgoing staff overlapped with the incoming shift and the maximum number of witnesses could be present. The rain had started an hour before, the kind of Philadelphia rain that felt like the city's default setting, gray and persistent and cold. Sarah was heading to her car when Dr. Ashford intercepted her near the entrance, and with him came 2 members of the hospital board, one of them a man she recognized as a cardiothoracic surgeon who golfed with the hospital's chief administrator. Ashford held a folder thick enough that it could contain a small book, and when he opened it in front of the gathering staff, the pages made that particular sound of rustling that meant documentation, which meant consequences that could stick. "Nurse Chen," he said, his voice carrying the kind of authority that made people stop and listen, "I have here detailed incident reports documenting a pattern of policy violation spanning the past 3 years. He flipped through pages without reading them. Sarah caught the dates on the folder tabs, incidents from periods when she'd been on different units, different shifts. None of it was real. All of it was devastating. Failure to follow chain of command, Ashford continued, reading from a script he'd clearly practiced. Insubordination during physician-led procedures. Scope creep into diagnostic assessments beyond nursing parameters. Interference with treatment protocols. He looked up at Sarah and then back at the gathered staff. Effective immediately, Nurse Chen is being placed on probationary status pending a formal review. She will work only under supervised double-check protocols. No independent medication administration. No autonomous assessments. Any patient care she provides will be verified by a senior nurse and witnessed by physician staff. Sarah took the folder when he extended it, her hand steady, her face empty of expression. The rain was beginning to soak through her jacket, running down the back of her neck in cold rivulets. Around her, staff members were looking away or down, the way people did when someone was being dismantled in front of them and they understood that looking directly at the suffering made them complicit. She opened the folder. The pages were filled with incident reports she'd never signed, violations she'd never committed, dates and times that didn't align with her schedule. It was beautiful work, in a way, thorough, meticulous, the kind of documentation that would survive any initial challenge because it had been built by someone who understood institutional systems well enough to make them weaponize themselves. "Do you have any questions about the probationary process?" Ashford asked, and she heard in his voice the satisfaction of a man who'd transformed his authority into institutional armor, who'd made himself unassailable by simply producing the right paperwork. Sarah closed the folder. She looked at him for exactly 3 seconds, long enough for him to understand that she'd processed the depth of what he'd done, long enough for him to feel the weight of her attention, and then she spoke in a voice so quiet that the gathering staff had to quiet their own breathing to hear her. "I understand, Doctor." She walked to her car with the probationary folder under her arm and the rain beginning to fall harder. Behind her, she heard Ashford continuing to speak to the board members, already establishing the narrative, already reinforcing the image of a young nurse who'd overreached her competence and needed to be managed back into appropriate submission. What happened next would rewrite all of that. But not yet. Not for 2 weeks. Not until the night when the hospital would shake with the arrival of something that transcended hierarchy, that made folders and board connections and carefully documented lies into the irrelevant paper they'd always been. Sarah drove home in the rain and didn't know she was being watched by a system that had been looking for her for 3 years. 2 weeks into probation, the fluorescent lights above the trauma wing flickered like dying stars. Sarah moved through the corridors at 2,300 hours with the kind of precision that came from muscle memory so old it predated her nursing license. The hospital was a tomb at this hour, empty gurneys lined up like sentries, monitors dark and silent, the smell of antiseptic cutting through the stale air conditioning. She was alone on the night shift. That was the point. Ashford had made it official in a memo citing staffing flexibility, but everyone knew it was isolation. Punishment disguised as scheduling. She didn't mind. Solitude was safer than scrutiny. The cardboard box sat in her locker. She hadn't packed it yet, but she'd bought it anyway, a small act of preparation that felt less like defeat and more like readiness. The cracked mug with the faded lettering was already there, waiting. The dying succulent on her dashboard at home. The photograph she couldn't throw away. All of it waiting for the moment she'd have to leave. Sarah moved through the empty trauma bays, checking equipment that didn't need checking, straightening supplies that were already straight. Ritual kept the hands busy. Ritual kept the mind from wandering to places it shouldn't go. At 0300 hours, the radio crackled to life like a breaking bone. Seattle General, this is Life Flight 7. We have a Priority 1 medevac incoming. ETA for minutes. Level 1 trauma alert. The dispatcher's voice was clipped, efficient. Sarah's spine straightened. She'd heard that tone 1,000 times, in a different context, a different life. A life she'd buried so deep that sometimes she forgot it had existed at all. Copy Life Flight 7, the radio responded. Stand by for bed assignment. Sarah moved to the windows facing the landing pad. The night sky split open with rotor wash and red lights cutting through the darkness like surgical instruments. The Black Hawk descended with the precision of something that had learned to dance with death. She could smell the diesel exhaust even from inside, that acrid burnt metal stench that meant someone had been in the kind of place where acrid burnt metal was a perfume. Her hand steadied against the windowsill. The rotor wash shook the glass. Resident surgeons were already running toward the landing pad, moving with the disoriented urgency of people dragged from sleep. Sarah's phone buzzed. Bed assignment came through. Trauma Bay 3. Her bay. The one she'd been cleaning for weeks out of habit, even though it never got used. Isolation had its advantages. The stretcher arrived like a prophecy. The man on it was massive, 6'3", maybe 240 pounds of muscle and uniform. Navy dress blue saturated with blood. Dark blood. The kind that meant deep tissue damage. Chest wounds. Multiple entry points. His face was grey-white, the color of concrete. His breathing was shallow, irregular, the kind of breathing that came just before it stopped coming at all. A Navy corpsman was running alongside, calling out vitals with the frantic precision of someone who'd seen enough combat to know what death looked like when it was walking beside you. Admiral James Kovacs, 54, 9 gunshot wounds, collapsed right pneumothorax, pelvic fracture, presumed hepatic laceration. Lost approximately 2 liters en route. Vitals are tanking. We need to move. Now. Admiral. Of course it was an admiral. Of all the trauma cases in all the hours of the night, it was a man with stars on his shoulders and blood in his lungs. They wheeled him into Trauma Bay 3 and transferred him to the surgical table with the choreographed violence of a practice team. Monitors went live. Fours went in. A residence, Sarah recognized the surgical resident, a young man named Chen, no relation, barked orders that sounded like suggestions more than commands. The attending was nowhere to be seen. That would be Ashford, probably still in his office, checking his inbox, confident that the overnight team could handle anything that came through those doors. They were wrong about that. The Admiral's oxygen saturation was 67 and falling. His chest was rising and falling in that peculiar way that meant one lung had given up the fight. Pneumothorax. The collapsed lung was a wall between him and breathing. His heart rate was 138. His blood pressure was 72/40 and dropping like a stone. The monitors beeped their algorithmic panic. The room moved with the jerky, hesitant motion of people operating without a clear captain. "Get me 2 more units ONEG," the resident called out. "Get chest imaging. I need to decompress that pneumothorax before." The Admiral's body convulsed. His eyes rolled back. The monitor flatlined into a single, accusatory tone. He was coding. His chest was heaving, his body trying to pull oxygen from air that couldn't reach his lungs. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water. The color drained from his face to something that wasn't any color at all. 30 seconds of this. 40. The room had gone rigid with the particular paralysis that comes when there's no clear next move. The resident was frozen over the patient's chest, his hands hovering uselessly. Someone was doing compressions, but they weren't confident compressions, they were afraid compressions, the kind that said the person doing them believed they were already too late. Blood was filling the Admiral's chest cavity faster than it could drain. A hemothorax. The collapsed lung was one problem. The hemorrhage was another. Sarah could see it in the way his skin was darkening, the way his body was drowning from the inside. He had maybe 2 minutes. Maybe 1. She was moving before conscious thought caught up with her hands. The scalpel was exactly where it should be. She'd know where surgical instruments were kept in the dark, underwater, on fire. The knowledge was older than her nursing credentials. Older than Seattle General. Older than the name Sarah Chen. She picked up the scalpel and made a vertical incision between the Admiral's ribs, 5th intercostal space, midclavicular line, the same line she'd cut through in a field hospital in Kandahar with a combat knife and the rotor wash of a Chinook helicopter vibrating her teeth. "What the hell are you doing?" Ashford's voice came from somewhere far away, as if he were calling from underwater. She didn't answer. She cut deeper, her voice dropping an octave, her words shifting into the clipped cadence of a combat medic who'd done this with mortars falling nearby. "Rib spreader. Now. Someone bag him at 100% oxygen. I need suction and 2 units of ONEG running wide open." A resident handed her the spreader with shaking hands. She inserted it and cranked the Admiral's ribs apart. Her hands were slick with blood. The ribs separated with the sound of something breaking that was supposed to break. She could see his lung now, collapsed and dark. She could see the source of the hemorrhage, a severed intercostal artery, bleeding into the pleural space like a faucet someone had forgotten to turn off. "Clamp," she said. The clamp appeared in her hand as if the universe itself was conspiring to keep this man alive. She reached into his open chest cavity and tied off the bleeder with sutures, her fingers working with the muscle memory of someone who'd held lives together in circumstances that would have broken most people. The room was dead silent except for the monitor. The Admiral's oxygen saturation started climbing. 78, 82, 88, 92. His color began returning. The gray-white face started to look like something that might still be alive. His chest began to rise on its own. Spontaneous respiration. Sinus rhythm, someone whispered. But Ashford's face was white with something that wasn't fear. It was fury. It was the fury of a man whose absolute authority had just been overridden in front of an entire medical team. He signaled to security with a jerk of his chin. 2 guards entered the trauma bay as if they'd been waiting outside the doors, waiting for the signal that would let them do what they'd been instructed to do all along. "Remove Nurse Chen from this bay immediately," Ashford said. "She just performed an unauthorized surgical procedure. That's a termination-level violation of protocol." Sarah didn't resist. She straightened from the Admiral's open chest and stepped back. The guards took her by the arms, and she let them. Her scrubs were soaked with blood. Her hands were shaking. Not from fear. From something older. Something that had learned long ago that winning came with consequences that echoed for years. They walked her out into the hallway while the medical team continued working to stabilize the patient. She could hear Ashford's voice behind her, already on his phone, already making the calls that would burn her to ash. What happened next ended the night shift as she'd known it. Security was already moving when Ashford's voice cut through the trauma bay like a scalpel. Two guards in grey uniforms, radios crackling static. Sarah's hands were still wet with the Admiral's blood. She didn't resist. Resistance would have meant acknowledging the accusation that she'd overstepped, that a nurse had no business performing a procedure that required a surgeon's license. She lowered the trauma shears, set them on the instrument tray with a click that nobody heard because Ashford was already talking, already narrating the disaster to the security officers in a voice smooth as oil on water. She performed an unauthorized procedure without physician authorization, he said, not looking at Sarah. Looking past her. The way you look at someone who's already ceased to exist. Patient safety violation. Remove her from the bay. The guards didn't know what they were looking at. One of them, Rodriguez, according to his nameplate, hesitated for exactly 2 seconds. Long enough to notice her eyes. Long enough to see something that didn't match the story he'd just heard. Then his partner's hand moved to Sarah's elbow, not rough, just firm, and she walked. Her scrub still dripped copper-colored water onto the white tile floor. Each drop sounded like a small bell ringing in the silence. Ashford was already on his phone before she reached the corridor. HR? This is Dr. Marcus Ashford, Chief of Emergency Medicine. I need an incident report filed immediately. Yes, now. An authorized procedure performed by nursing staff. Emergency thoracotomy without physician authorization. I have witnesses. Chart number 847 Kovacs. Yes, I'll wait. Sarah could hear him from the hallway, his voice carrying the particular satisfaction of a man holding the perfect weapon. She kept walking. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical hymn. Behind her, through the trauma bay window, the Admiral lay still on the stretcher, ventilator breaths inflating his chest in precise mechanical rhythm. Alive! That was the only number that mattered. The phone call to the hospital board came at 11:33 p.m. Sarah knew because she was in the break room, not actually on break, just occupying space, when a resident poked his head in and said Ashford was requesting a staffing adjustment. By 11:52, she'd been reassigned. The Admiral's care team was being restructured. Dr. Ashford would be taking point. All secondary providers would be approved by his office. All consultant access would be filtered through him. The third call came at midnight. Sarah was already packing her locker when she heard the announcement. ICU access restricted for all nursing staff not directly assigned to Ashford's cases. New protocol effective immediately. No exceptions. She understood what was happening. It was elegant, really. Ashford wasn't just removing her from the Admiral's care. He was constructing a narrative that made her disappearance necessary. Unsafe nurse. Protocol violation. Patient safety concern. By the time anyone asked where she was, the story would already be cemented into the hospital's institutional memory, supported by his written reports, approved by the board member he'd called, probably someone who'd never met her, wouldn't care, would simply rubber stamp whatever the chief of emergency medicine requested. And he'd done it all while she was standing in a trauma bay holding a human heart together in her hands. Sarah sat on the bench in front of her locker and looked at the contents. A spare scrub top. Compression socks. A half-empty tube of sunscreen. A cracked coffee mug that read "World's Okayest Nurse," a joke gift from someone at the last hospital, someone whose name she'd already forgotten because that was the price of invisibility. You couldn't afford to remember people. People complicated things. The real problem wasn't the false incident report. Wasn't the reassignment or the access restriction or Ashford's perfectly orchestrated destruction of her credibility in a single shift. The real problem was that saving the Admiral meant he was going to wake up. And when he woke up, he would talk. Operation Sandcastle wasn't classified because it was secret. It was classified because it had never happened. 12 hostages extracted from a compound in Kandahar in 2019. A 75th Ranger Regiment attachment working with a medical unit that didn't exist on any official roster. Sarah among them, using a rank that didn't appear in any system because she'd been officially discharged 3 months before the operation even launched. Dead paperwork. Ghost credentials. Everything designed so that if anyone asked, the answer was always the same: no such operation. The hostages had been debriefed. Sworn to silence. The Rangers had been reassigned to different bases, different continents, scattered like seeds so they couldn't talk to each other. And Sarah had walked away from it all, accepted a civilian nursing position, and learned how to be invisible. Learned how to survive by not existing. If the Admiral talked about Sandcastle, about the extraction team, about the combat medic who'd coordinated the emergency medicine during their escape, if he started connecting dots that reporters could connect, then everything everyone on that team had sacrificed would be exposed. The classified details would become historical facts. Analysts would start asking why the operation was buried. People would lose their security clearances. People would lose their careers. People would lose their lives because their covers had been blown and their enemies would know exactly where to find them. Sarah pulled the photograph out of her locker. 12 people in Kandahar dust, October 2019. Some wearing Ranger tabs. One in modified civilian clothes, jeans and a borrowed shirt because she was officially off the books. All of them holding their weapons with the casual confidence of people who'd already survived the worst the world could offer. She ran her thumb across the faces. Crossed out one by one in black marker. Holloway. Dead in a car accident, official report. Mercer. Suicide, supposedly. Gator. Friendly fire during a routine patrol. Each one a cover story that sounded plausible enough if you didn't know that plausible was code for the enemy found out they existed. Half their faces were crossed out now. Half their faces were ghosts. If Sarah resurfaced as a decorated officer, if she admitted what she'd done and where she'd learned it, then the remaining faces would become targets. That was the arithmetic. 1 nurse's career against 7 people's lives. The calculation had already been done for her, years ago, when command had made her decision for her. So she didn't fight Ashford's suspension. She didn't call a lawyer. Didn't demand a hearing or file a grievance or contact the state nursing board. Didn't do any of the things that would raise her profile and start asking questions that couldn't be safely answered. Instead, she emptied her locker. Mug went into the cardboard box. The succulent on her desk that had somehow survived 3 months without water, it went in too, dirt falling like sand. The photograph with its crossed-out faces got wrapped in a piece of newspaper and placed at the bottom where nobody would see it unless they were looking for it. By 12:02 a.m., the paperwork was complete. Ashford had personally reviewed the termination documents. Grounds: unauthorized practice beyond scope, violation of medical protocol, patient safety concern. Effective immediately. No severance, no recommendation. Just gone. The way you became unmade. At 11 p.m. on the next shift, a full day later, because Ashford had given her the courtesy of 24 hours to exit his hospital without creating more paperwork, Sarah stood at a bus stop on the corner of 11th and Market Streets. The rain had been coming down for 4 hours straight, the kind of October rain that soaked through everything and never quite felt clean. Her scrubs clung to her legs, still damp from the night shift despite the passage of time. She hadn't bothered to change. Hadn't bothered to shower. Hadn't bothered with anything that might be mistaken for self-care. The cardboard box sat on her hip. Mug. Succulent. Photograph with the faces. A car splashed through a gutter, sending brown water across her shins. She didn't flinch. Just shifted the box slightly and waited for the bus that was going to take her to a motel where she'd already booked 3 nights under a name that wasn't hers. From there she'd figure out what came next. Another city, probably. Another hospital under another name. Another invisible shift, years of them, until the last of the faces in that photograph had gone dark and there was no one left who could connect her to anything that mattered. The rain kept falling. It didn't care about operations that had never happened or nurses who'd stopped existing or admirals who were going to wake up in a hospital and start asking questions nobody could safely answer. Behind her, inside Seattle General, the Admiral was breathing easy for the first time in 72 hours. His oxygen saturation was climbing. His blood pressure was stable. And in 6 hours, when the morning rounds began, he would be awake enough to ask where the nurse was. The one with the steady hands. The one who'd saved his life. And Dr. Marcus Ashford would smile politely and explain that the nurse had been removed from the case. Protocol violation. Patient safety concern. Everything by the book, everything professional, everything designed so that no one could fault him for anything. Everything a lie. The bus pulled up to the curb, its doors hissing open like a machine exhaling. Sarah stepped aboard, still holding her cardboard box, still wearing scrubs that were beginning to dry in the stale recirculated air of public transit. The box went under her seat. She found a window and pressed her forehead against the cool glass. Outside, the city moved past in a blur of rain and streetlights. Somewhere behind her, the Admiral was sleeping the sleep of someone who'd been sewn back together by hands that didn't officially exist. His body was healing. His mind was beginning to surface. And he was going to remember. 72 hours after Sarah stood in the rain with nothing but a cardboard box, 6 black SUVs surrounded Seattle General's main entrance. The motorcade didn't announce itself. It didn't need to. The rotor wash from a Black Hawk helicopter shaking the parking lot was announcement enough. The Secretary of Defense walked through the emergency room doors at 9:51 a.m. flanked by 2 Marine Guards in dress blues, their dress uniforms sharp enough to cut glass. He didn't stop at reception. He didn't ask for a directory. He looked directly at the charge nurse, the same nurse who'd recorded Sarah's parking lot demotion on her phone, and said only 6 words, "Where is Major Sarah Chen?" The air in the lobby changed. Not metaphorically. The atmospheric pressure seemed to drop 10 millibars. The charge nurse's mouth opened. Closed. Opened again. "I'm sorry, sir, we have no one by that." "Nightingale 6, the secretary said. His voice was quiet. It wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in 3 syllables. "That's her call sign. Find her." In the waiting room, Admiral Kovacs's daughter, a Navy captain herself, 34 years old, stationed at Norfolk, was holding her father's medical file with both hands. Her fingers trembled as she read the notes. Trauma surgery. Field thoracotomy. Emergency procedure performed by nursing staff. Unauthorized. Suspension pending termination. She read the surgeon's name 3 times before her voice worked. "Sarah Chen," she whispered aloud to the empty room. Then, louder, "Major Sarah Chen." The name sounded different when spoken in rank. It sounded like truth. A SEAL team leader emerged from the stairwell. He'd been in Kandahar during Operation Sandcastle, 3 years ago, on the extraction team that pulled 12 hostages out of a Taliban compound. He'd been calling the Admiral's room every 6 hours since the helicopter landed. When he heard the captain speak that rank aloud, he stepped forward and began to recite what most of the country didn't know. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. Purple Heart. Twice. Each medal received its own sentence. Each sentence landed like a hammer blow. And a recommendation for the soldier's medal that got buried with the operation itself. He paused. We all knew. Everyone on that extraction knew. We just didn't know where she went. Dr. Marcus Ashford was in the chief's office reviewing the termination paperwork when his phone began to ring. His mentor, the hospital board member who'd endorsed his hire, the one who documented Sarah's scope violations, was calling. Ashford watched the phone buzz. He answered. "Marcus, we need to talk." The voice on the other end was already distancing. "I'm reviewing the incident report you filed. The one about the Chen nurse. I'm looking at the timestamps." Ashford's stomach tightened. "Yes, I documented. You documented incidents on dates when you weren't on shift. Security footage shows no one fitting your description of any of these events." "And Marcus?" The mentor's voice had become clinical. There's video of the trauma arrival. I've just been shown that video by federal investigators. You were in the trauma bay. And you froze. The line went dead. 90 seconds later, a hospital administrator appeared at Ashford's office door with an IT director and 2 federal agents. The IT director was Chen, not Sarah Chen, but David Chen, a Marine veteran who worked in hospital IT systems. He'd been waiting for this moment since 6 a.m. the morning after the Admiral's surgery, when Ashford had personally called requesting routine data cleanup. David had refused and documented the request. Dr. Ashford, these agents need to speak with you regarding the security footage from Trauma Bay 3, the administrator said. The administrator wouldn't meet his eyes. Specifically, regarding your attempts to have it deleted from the server at 6:14 a.m. on the morning of May 17th. Ashford's face drained of color. Not metaphorically, the blood actually left his features like someone had unplugged a sink. His mouth opened. No words came out. His hands gripped the edge of his desk hard enough to leave fingerprints in the varnish. One of the federal agents, a woman with the bearing of someone who'd arrested worse than him before breakfast, placed a laptop on his desk. We're going to show you the video from the trauma arrival. Then we're going to explain what counts as obstruction of justice when it involves a federal investigation into a military medical matter. The footage played. Ashford watched himself freeze as Sarah's hands moved with the kind of precision that only came from having done this in the field. He watched as she performed a left anterolateral thoracotomy using a scalpel, her hand spreading his patient's ribs with the mechanical efficiency of a surgeon who'd already lost count of how many lives she'd held open. He watched himself barking contradictory orders while she established hemostasis and began the resuscitation protocol. He watched himself call security to have her removed. And then he watched the federal agent pause the video on Sarah's face. There was no fear there. No panic. No uncertainty. There was only the absolute calm of someone who'd already survived worse than this moment represented. Major Chen saved Admiral Kovacs's life, the agent said. Despite your interference. Now, we have questions about your employment record, your documentation practices, and your conduct toward this officer. You're going to answer those questions, or we're going to answer them for you using the court system. Ashford said nothing. He couldn't. The room was still. You could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electronic monotone. In the Admiral's hospital room, he was sitting up now. Breathing on his own. The ventilator had been removed that morning. He was reading through a stack of classified briefings the Pentagon had declassified specifically for this moment, redacted at key points, but enough. Enough to understand what Sarah had given up. When the Secretary of Defense appeared in his doorway with a folder containing Sarah's personnel file, the Admiral's eyes went wet. Not from pain. From understanding. He'd been missing pieces for 72 hours. Now he had them all. She coordinated your extraction, the Secretary said. 75th Ranger Regiment Medical Support. She was the only surgeon with the training to navigate that specific operational theater. After Sandcastle was buried, she was reassigned to civilian work with a standing order, stay invisible. Maintain the cover. Protect the operation. The Secretary opened the folder. Sarah's photograph was there, a thinner, younger, in 75th Ranger Regiment operational gear. Then you arrived at Seattle General. And you decided she needed to be broken. The Admiral looked at the photograph and understood why she'd accepted demotion without fighting. Why she'd left without protest. Why she'd stood in the rain alone. Where is she? He asked. That's the question, sir, the Secretary said. Right now, she's probably not aware that the entire federal government just learned what she gave up. That the security footage exists. That 3 major institutions are currently dismantling the career of the man who forced her out. A phone began to ring. Sarah's phone. The one she'd kept in the cardboard box with the cracked mug and the dying succulent. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she recognized the calling code pattern. Pentagon direct line. The number she'd been trained on 15 years ago. Major Chen, the voice said. It was the Secretary of Defense. "We need you back." In the Philadelphia Federal Building, Dr. Marcus Ashford was being processed for questioning regarding obstruction of justice, workplace harassment, and filing false reports with a federal medical authority. His hands shook as they took his watch, his wallet, his phone. His carefully constructed authority, the hierarchy he'd built brick by brick through connections and deference to the right people, had evaporated in 72 hours. The hospital board had already voted to strip him of his chief title. The state medical board had already opened a formal investigation. His mentor had already retained a separate attorney. As they placed him in an interview room, the federal agent slid a single photograph across the table. It showed Sarah performing the thoracotomy. Below it, a caption in military notation: Major Sarah Chen, 75th Ranger Regiment Medical Support, Operation Sandcastle Classified Extraction, 3 consecutive commendations for field medicine under fire. That, the agent said, is the person you tried to destroy. In case you're still confused about why that was a catastrophically bad decision. Ashford said nothing. He could say nothing. There were no words in the English language that could explain how badly he'd miscalculated. How completely he'd failed to see what he was actually looking at. 6 months later, Sarah wore her major's insignia again. The oak leaf cluster caught the fluorescent light of Seattle General's third-floor corridor as she walked past the night security station. A man in a navy blue probationary security uniform, name tag reading Ashford, M., looked up from his desk and immediately looked down. He stepped aside so she could pass. She didn't acknowledge him. She didn't need to. His silence was all the acknowledgement that mattered. In Admiral Kovacs's hospital room, he stood when she entered. This was his follow-up consult, his post-operative cardiac workup. But when he saw her in full dress uniform, he abandoned protocol entirely and extended his hand. "They told me what happened," he said. "What you gave up to stay invisible. I'm sorry it took getting shot 9 times to bring you home." Sarah smiled, the first true smile anyone had seen on her face in 3 years. "You gave me the excuse I needed, sir." Outside the hospital, she paused at the break room window. Someone had placed a healthy succulent on the sill with a handwritten note, "For Nightingale 6. Beside it sat her cracked mug, repaired with gold resin in the Japanese kintsugi style. The breaks had been filled with precious metal. The fractures had become beautiful. Sarah picked up the mug. She could see her reflection in the gold. Not the invisible night shift nurse. Not the soldier who'd buried herself in silence. Just Sarah. Complete. Whole. Home. At Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, her nameplate outside the trauma surgery office read, Major Sarah Chen, MD, Trauma Surgery. The office had a window overlooking the Potomac. During a Pentagon ceremony 3 weeks later, the Admiral pinned the soldier's medal to her dress uniform and spoke into the microphone with his voice still rough from the breathing tube. "The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together," he said. And everyone in that room, generals, Pentagon officials, Navy leadership, the parents of the 12 hostages she'd extracted from Kandahar, understood exactly what he meant. Subscribe for more stories about the ones we overlook. The ones whose silence is strength. The ones whose restraint is power. Like this video, comment who you think deserved the worst punishment, and let us know, what would you have done in Sarah's position?